So, welcome to Father's Day. Most of us were lucky enough to have fathers or father figures in our lives. And those of you that did, you know what I'm speaking about. Unfortunately, 49 people right now have parents, fathers and mothers, who are without a loved one as of what happened last week. So with your permission, I'd like just to have 49 seconds of silence as we remember the lives lost last Sunday. Father, I ask your presence in the lives that have been shattered and devastated by what happened last week. I ask, Lord, that your presence be there for those that survived, for those that are grieving, for those that were lost. Lord, I ask that you instill in all of us a sense of compassion and grace and forgiveness. Amen. Thank you all for indulging me. So this is Father's Day, and I'm mindful of the fact that last year, the day before Father's Day, was a very special day. Does anybody remember what that day was? The day before Father's Day last year? It was Saturday. They got it right away. They got it right away last service. It was Saturday. But more than just Saturday, it was a very special Saturday. It was, and I had a drum roll last time. I don't have a drum roll this time, but last year, the Saturday before Father's Day was a day that was sanctified. Sanctified is one of those religious words where it says it's set aside for. It was sanctified for cleaning the Beery garage. So it was clean the Beery garage day. And I went down to Lowe's and I picked myself up some of those shelves that you see there, 3 packages of them. And I had this silly idea. I thought that if I went down to Lowe's and I bought these 3 things, and they were quite heavy, so I got a guy from the church to help me put them in the back of the truck. We brought them home and I stacked them up very neatly in the corner of my garage. And I figured their mere presence there would help me organize my garage. It turns out you've actually got to put them together. Who knew? But at any rate, so we got those things put together, and Saturday rolls around, and we're starting to clean up the garage, and I noticed something. As I'm stacking things on those shelves, despite the fact that there were 5 levels on each of these shelves, and there were 3 sets of shelves, and what does that work out to? Something like 15 shelves altogether? I sat there stuffing them in. I had more stuff than I had shelf space. And that was a problem. That meant that I had to start prioritizing what I was sticking on the shelves. And I began to think, that's a pretty good metaphor for life. We need to prioritize our lives because there isn't enough room for everything that we might want to stick into our lives. So I'm going to talk today about stuff. Now I understand that one of your previous pastors like to talk about stuff all the time. Well, I'm going to talk about stuff. But pastors typically like to talk about the good stuff. I'm not going to talk about the good stuff. You heard all about the good stuff. I'm going to talk about the bad stuff because that's the stuff that's interesting. There really are only 3 types of stuff in our lives. We have the good stuff, the stuff that we really want and we're going to keep. And we have the old stuff, the stuff that used to be good stuff, but now it's not. For whatever reason, now it's not. And then we have the bad stuff, the stuff that we never, ever really wanted to have, but for whatever reason, we still got it. So I'm going to focus primarily on option number 3, the bad stuff. Maybe it's that fat envelope from the IRS. Maybe you ever get that fat envelope from the IRS? Are you willing to? Not an honest person in the bunch? Really? Yeah, you get the thin envelope from the IRS, that's got a check in it. That's a good envelope. But the minute you get those fat envelopes, That means they want to audit something, or they're turning back something from your stock options. They want to it's a fat envelope from the IRS, but not good news. Just not good news. Maybe it's a toothache. Not many of us like toothaches, but we're afraid of the dentist. So for whatever reason, because we're afraid of the dentist, we'll live with the toothache. It's a bad thing, but we'll keep it. Maybe it's that sweater that Aunt Edna knitted for you. Anybody here named Edna? I asked this in the first service too. Thankfully, no hands went up. It's a sweater that Aunt Edna knit for you. It's got one arm down to here and one arm up to here. And quite frankly, unless you're a Gator fan, whoever thought that purple and lime green and orange was a good color combination? But Aunt Edna, she's one of your mother's. I'm sorry, your mother's favorite sisters. So you got to keep the sweater. You don't want it. It's a lousy sweater. You don't need it in Florida, but you got it anyway. So my point is, we tend to accumulate things in our lives that for some reason we refuse to get rid of. Now with this thought in mind, I want to tell you about something that I heard not too long ago. I was on vacation with my family. We were in Ohio, and I was actually at my praise team lead's home church. This was the church that she had grown up in, and her father-in-law was the pastor there, and we listened to the sermon. It was a good sermon. It wasn't, I can't tell you now what it was, but it was a good sermon. Bert, if you're hearing me, it was a good sermon. But at any rate, we listened to it, and then after that, they had their time for prayers and concerns. And they're going through the various things that happen there, and this woman gets up, and she says, I want to share with you something I saw on Facebook. And my heart seized up. Because as a pastor, I can tell you, I've seen things on Facebook that should never see the light of day in a church. And this woman is about to share something that she saw on Facebook. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my gosh, what's going to happen here? But then I thought, this isn't my church. I'm not the pastor. Let her rip. What's the worst that could happen? So she tells this story. It turns out it's a story that she had heard on Facebook that a guy by the name of Graham Cook had shared. It was a dream that Graham Cook had. And Graham Cook, if you don't know, is a pastor. He's got his own congregation. He does a lot of motivational speaking. But he was describing this dream in this little story that's on Facebook. And I was so captivated by what this woman was saying that I immediately, when I got home, went out and looked for this. And I found a video of this little clip that Graham Cook did. And I was surprised, and it touched me in a way that very few dreams that other people have can touch me. Graham Cook is standing on a hill. He's having this dream. He's standing on a hill, and off in the distance, he sees Christ. And he's excited because he's a pastor. Pastors like to see Christ. And there is Christ, and he's stoked, and Christ is walking in his general direction. And he's like, oh, this is neat. But then as Christ gets a little bit closer, he notices that Jesus is mad. And this is a little bit concerning because the only thing scarier than seeing the face of God is to see the face of God angry. And here we've got God incarnate walking towards Graham Cook, and he's mad. Now, I don't know how mad he was, but he was mad. He might have been kind of like a Bobby Knight type of mad, where he's throwing the chairs and this, that, and the other. When Jesus was in the temple courtyard and he's turning over the money changers' tables and what, that type of mad. So Graham Cook is watching Jesus walk in his general direction, and he's looking mad, and Graham Cook is a little bit concerned because as Jesus comes closer and closer, he realizes that Jesus isn't walking to anybody else. He's walking to Graham Cook. And as I said before, that's got to be terrifying. To see God in the flesh and to see him coming towards you and angry, that's got to be a cause for concern. Can I get an amen on that? That's got to be a cause for concern. So Jesus is walking towards Graham Cook. Graham Cook sees that he's angry. He starts backing up a little bit. And Jesus keeps coming, and Graham Cook, he continues to back up a little bit. And Jesus keeps coming, and Graham Cook, he keeps backing up a little bit. See, here's the problem. Jesus is God incarnate. Jesus made everything. There's no place that you and I can go that God can't go. And so no matter how far Graham Cook backed up, Jesus was eventually going to get to him. And he did. And Graham Cook is terrified. And Jesus sits there and he looks at Graham Cook and he sits there and he says, "Give me back my stuff. Give me back my stuff. Now, I can imagine the whole list of things that Graham Cook is thinking in his mind about why Jesus might be angry with him and why Jesus is going to approach him and what Jesus might actually say once he got up to him. And I got to tell you, give me back my stuff wouldn't have been high on that list. And yet there it is. Give me back my stuff. Graham says, Lord, all that I have you gave me. Well, what do you want back? No. No. You took something from me that I never intended for you to have. Give it back. Give it back. Lord, I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. You took my stuff. I paid for it. I paid for it on the cross. It's mine. I want it back. Lord, I don't understand. Give me back the greed, the bigotry, the fear, the anxiety, the self-doubt, the guilt, the selfishness. I paid for all of that on the cross. It's not yours. It's mine. I want it back. You see, Graham's dream had a point. Our lives are like the shelves in my garage. There's only so much room. You need to prioritize. You need to be able to toss out the old stuff and the bad stuff to make room for the good stuff. That makes sense, doesn't it? The problem is we as humans tend to want to hold on to that bad stuff. It's part of our fallen nature. It doesn't make any sense, but it's what we do. Let me be clear. Let me be clear. The bad stuff separates you from God and the grace-filled life that God wants you to have. Now, there are three scriptural points that I want to make for your consideration this morning. The first comes from Isaiah 61. God does not want you to store up the bad stuff in your lives. Graham's dream was biblical. Give me back my stuff. So Isaiah 61 reads as follows, and I hope it's up on the screen. Excellent. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from the darkness for prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and the garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. That word instead appears 5 times in the complete passage. It's a critical word. Beauty instead of ashes, joy instead of mourning, praise instead of despair. The entire passage is talking about replacing the bad stuff in our lives with the good stuff in our lives. Who would have thought cleaning up a garage was biblical? You can think of this passage as kind of an instruction manual for humanity that the Lord has given to each of us. Warning, this coffee may be hot. That's bad stuff. This coffee is not hot. It's good. It's beautiful. We are to proclaim the good news, which is, by the way, what the word the gospel means. We're to replace ashes with beauty, mourning with joy, despair with praise, etc., etc., etc. Translation, our responsibility as Christians is to actively replace the bad stuff in our lives with the good stuff that we want there. All right? The good stuff comes out of the Gospels. Our role as Christians is not to sit around and let the world happen. That's a way to store up the bad stuff. Our role as Christians is to actively replace the bad stuff with the good stuff. With the good stuff. You know, I went to college with a guy who was the proverbial glass half empty type of guy. If we got dismissed from a class 15 minutes early, most of us are ecstatic. This is the guy who say, well, now I've got to find something to do with these 15 minutes. This is the guy who, if the mess hall or the cafeteria ran out of beef liver for whatever reason, and they decided to replace the beef liver with sirloin steak, he'd be complaining it was a prime rib. This is the type of guy who was sunny outside, he'd be complaining it was hot. It was always half empty. And here's the thing, no one, and absolutely no one, wanted to be around this guy. And it only made his life worse because he was always so negative. The greed, the bigotry, the fear, the anxiety, the self-doubt, the guilt, and the big one, the selfishness. These all serve to separate us from a relationship with a God from a relationship with God and from a relationship with each other. Just like this guy's negativity served to isolate him from the rest of the students on campus. What's the greatest commandment the Lord gave us? Anybody? Sorry, what? I'm going to have a conversation with Pastor Chris. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength. And the second is like it, love your neighbor. And on these two, all the law and the prophets hang. Anybody know what I mean when I say the law and the prophets? That was a slang term used to refer to the entirety of the Bible. So every time you see in the Bible the phrase, the law and the prophets, you're sitting there, or sometimes they just abbreviate it, the law. They're talking about the entirety of the Old Testament. So Jesus is telling them that the two most important things are love God and love your neighbor, and everything else hangs on those two things. Everything that you read in the Bible, in Numbers and Leviticus and all these other things, all of these things hang on these first two primary principles, love God and love your neighbor. Greed, bigotry, fear, anxiety, self-doubt, guilt, and the big one, selfishness, they all serve to separate us from both God and our neighbor. Not good. Jesus died on the cross so that none of these things ever need stand in the way of our relationship with God. When we refuse to surrender them, when we refuse to give them back, we're denying Christ on the cross at Calvary. I don't know about you, but that would make me upset. Let me put it a different way. Remember how in Graham's dream Jesus was angry? Imagine how you'd feel if you went out of your way to do something nice for somebody. If you sat down and you sacrificed mightily for them to have something, if you gave of yourself so much that you had less so that they might have more, and you did it out of love, and the person you did it for didn't appreciate it, they didn't say thank you, they didn't do anything, they just kind of ignored it and walked the other way, you'd feel gutted. You'd feel torn up inside. That's how God feels when we hold on to our bigotry and our self-doubt and our anger and our selfishness and all those other things that Christ paid for on the cross. Give me back my stuff. Now, one of the great things in the Bible is it tends to reinforce itself. That's what I love about it. The Bible is consistent from page 1 clear to the last page in Revelation. I mean, it's just consistent all the way through. This is illustrated in Philippians 4:8. Paul, the apostle, the evangelist, is the author of Philippians. He writes this in 4:8. And it makes the case for growing close to God by making some shelf space for the good stuff. He says, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. Make some shelf space, you'll have room for some good stuff. Now, I want to make two quick points here. The first is Paul is encouraging us to make shelf space for the good stuff, letting us know that we'll grow closer to God as a result. The second point, however, is buried in verse 9, towards the very end. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice. It's not enough to have space on your shelf for the good stuff. You got to use it. You got to share it. Learned, received, heard, seen. Christians demonstrate the good stuff. You probably heard pastors say, you may be the only gospels some people ever see. Make it a good news gospel. That's the Christian life. That's what we're to be. So Isaiah 61 tells us to replace the bad stuff with the good stuff. Philippians 4:8 through 9 echoes this and further encourages us to learn and to be examples to others, especially as regards the good stuff, the noble, the pure, the praiseworthy, etc. Luke 10:38, on the other hand, gives us a dose of reality. This is the final point I want to make, and it comes to us from Luke 10:38. This is the story of Mary and Martha. Are there any Marys or Marthas in the congregation today? I had a Martha in the first one. None? Okay, good. We're safe. If your name is Mary or Martha and you're too shy to put your hand up, I'm not talking about you. I mean, I am, but I'm talking about all of us. All of us at some point in our lives are both Mary and Martha. So these are two sisters with very different responses to Christ at different points in their lives. Each of us is going to be one of these two. Let me read you the NIV version of this. Starting verse 38. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he, being Jesus, came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and she asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her to help me. Jesus' response is great. He says, Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed. Indeed, only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. Here you have two sisters, one worried and upset and focused on the things that are not eternal, the bad stuff, the old stuff, and one that's focused on Christ, the good stuff. Martha is not making any shelf space for the good stuff that Christ was sharing. And remember, Martha is the one that invited Jesus into their house. Many of us have invited Jesus into our lives, but just like Martha, we're too busy holding on to worry and being upset by many things to really let Jesus transform us. Let's be honest. Many of us would prefer to be upset and be excited by those things that truly do matter. Now, I know it's not true in this church. I know it's not true here. But I imagine there could be some churches that I might be in where your pastor is normally dressed in a robe and he's got the stole on, everything else like that. And then some visiting pastor comes and he's preaching in blue jeans with sandals on, and you might be upset. I know that's not true here. I know that's not true here. But you might be fixated on the fact that your pastor is wearing blue jeans and sandals rather than a robe or any of those other things. I know it's nobody here. Some of the fastest and biggest growing churches in America are what they call let's be comfortable environments. They grow because everyone feels comfortable. Everyone feels welcome, no matter who they are or how they dress. There's a passage out of Luke 9, verses 46 through 48, that if every church in America would embrace these three verses out of Luke 9, they'd grow. But sadly, the world is filled with churches that deliberately choose to die rather than to recognize and embrace Luke 9, 46 through 48. Let me read them for you. An argument started amongst the disciples as to which of them would be the greatest. Jesus, knowing their thoughts, took a little child, and he had him stand beside him. And he said to them, whoever welcomes this little child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. For it is the one who is least among all of you who is the greatest. These disciples were focused on stuff that was not the good stuff. Who's the greatest? They were a lot like many of our churches. Is the music, what are the things we're focusing on? Is the music the type of music that I like? Is the pastor wearing a robe or blue jeans? Are the kids making too much noise? Or the big one, am I one of the biggest givers? And does the pastor know that I'm one of the biggest givers, so he pays attention to what I want? You better listen to me. Contrast what we're seeing in Martha, despite her being willing to invite Jesus in, to what Paul is saying in Philippians 4, pure and noble and righteous and praiseworthy. If we're completely honest with ourselves, and that's difficult to do, I understand that, but if we're completely honest with ourselves, most of us probably spend too much time in Martha mode and not enough time in Mary mode. And by the way, churches that live Luke 9:48, whoever welcomes this little child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Churches that make this their number one priority. Churches that are willing to give up absolutely everything that is near and dear to them except for the Bible itself in order to welcome that little child. Those are the churches in this country and in the world that are growing, without exception. Translation, if your church is not growing, are you living Luke 9:48, or are you stuck in Luke 9:46? Are you holding on to the bad stuff or the old stuff, the stuff that used to be good but now isn't? This, by the way, is where the selfishness comes in. We like our church to be just the way it is. Who cares about doing everything we can to invite in the next generation? It's all about me and what I like in a church. Selfishness. It's no wonder Jesus became angry in Graham's dream. Give me back my stuff. I paid for it on the cross. It's mine. Give it back. My hope is that each of you will let go of the bad stuff in your life. The guilt, the worry, the sorrow, the anxiety, the fear, the bigotry, and selfishness. May yours be a life filled with only the good stuff, where you make room for God in your life. Father, I ask that you bless this congregation and the people that they interact with this week. I ask, Lord, that they begin a period of introspection, where they discern what is the bad stuff, what is the old stuff, and make room in their lives for the good stuff. I ask this, Lord, in the name of your Son, Jesus the Christ, who paid for all of my sins on the cross at Calvary. Amen.